I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years.
Someone is robbing your kids. In fact, it's worse than that. A motley crew of professional robbers have banded together to plunder future generations of their wealth. It's the biggest, most sophisticated heists in American history, and it's happening right under our noses. It wasn't enough just to rob you and I. The fallout from this impossible caper will reverberate for generations to come. Imagine a scene from the future where your child or grandchild opens a vault only to discover that they've been robbed by time-traveling criminals from the past. Of course, I'm referring to the federal government and the national debt, which recently eclipsed $38 trillion, growing by over $1 trillion in a matter of weeks. $38 trillion is absolutely insane. But that's what Ronald Reagan thought when the United States crossed a single $1 trillion.
Our national debt is approaching $1 trillion. A few weeks ago, I called such a figure, $1 trillion, incomprehensible. If you had a stack of $1,000 bills in your hand, only 4 inches high, you'd be a millionaire. $1 trillion would be a stack of $1,000 bills 67 miles high.
In 2017, Convention of States made a video with PragerU and Senator Jim DeMint, decrying the nation's then
$20 trillion in debt. That's 13 zeros. Count them. 13.
Which, while serious, already feels a bit quaint. So do the math. 1981, Reagan sounds the alarm about $1 trillion. 36 years later, at the time of our video with PragerU, that number had grown by over $19 trillion. And in the 7 years since then, we've added an additional $18 trillion to the national debts, almost just as much in a fraction of the time. It's almost as if, as that number keeps getting bigger and bigger, it starts to mean less and less. $38 trillion is simply too immense to comprehend, and yet eventually we will reach a breaking point. And when that happens, it will become real to us.
When debt and debt service rise relative to your income, it's like plaque in the arteries. If you take the most analogous period, I would say we're in a period that's quite like 1937, 38. You have a debt issue.
Well, I speak to a lot of people in the business community, a lot of people in the financial community, and I think people are worried about the level of debt.
I know some of you are probably thinking politicians have been wringing their hands about this issue for decades, and nothing has happened. The United States is still prosperous, our economy is still afloat. Maybe the politicians were just overreacting, but something is shifting. The politicians in Washington may have turned a blind eye to the problem, but the people who pay the closest attention to these things are getting nervous.
Because our country is about to cross the Rubicon. If we don't constrain spending now, if we don't set the trajectory of lower debt now, we will not have a dollar, we will not have a strong economy.
Last year, billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio wrote a book titled How Countries Go Broke, in which he suggested that the United States may be heading towards a situation worse than a recession, perhaps even analogous to the 1930s. Elon Musk, fresh off his stint at the Department of Government Efficiency, offered a no less dour prediction.
Unless you could go like super draconian, like, you know, Genghis Khan level on cutting waste and fraud, then there's no way to solve the debt crisis.
Finally, Richard Haass, who has spent decades advising politicians in Washington, says he feels like Paul Revere, only he's not warning that the British are coming. He's warning that a national debt crisis is coming. Maybe $1 trillion was survivable. Maybe 20 was non-lethal. But the more I look into this, the more I become convinced this isn't just something debt hawks rant about on C-SPAN. At 250, the great American experiment in liberty is sitting on a ticking time bomb. If there's any hope for a great American future, we've got to slash our way through the forest of excess and wastes, find the bomb, and defuse it before it's too late.
If you talk to some of the economists that I talk to, both worldwide and some of the brightest people at Harvard and MIT and University of Texas, and Pennsylvania, they don't sleep at night right now because they know we're on the razor-thin edge of falling over a cliff.
Debt has always been a part of the American story. In order to win a war against the Earth's mightiest empire, the Continental Congress and the states had to borrow $79 million. This, Alexander Hamilton said in his first report on the public credit, was the price of liberty. In Article 6 of the United States Constitution, the founders made it clear that they intended to take responsibility for this debt, even under a new government. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Articles of Confederation. One of the major weaknesses of the government under the Articles of Confederation was that it lacked the power to collect tax revenue. Consequently, the United States struggled to pay its debt and even defaulted on its loans. The new Constitution aimed to fix that. However, it also sparked a rancorous clash between the Founding Fathers, what Thomas Jefferson dubbed the most bitter and angry contest ever known in Congress before or since the Union of the States. Hamilton, a true financial genius, whose meticulous 1790 report on public credit eventually helped service the debt, transforming the United States credit score to the highest in the world in less than half a decade, wanted to consolidate and assume the states' respective debts into a single national debt. There were multiple reasons for this. Chiefly, however, Hamilton wanted rich investors to feel a vested interest in the success of the newly formed central government. James Madison opposed this plan, arguing it was unfair to the southern states, which had already gone to great lengths to pay down their debts. Hamilton countered that the states had all equally benefited from the Revolution, and therefore should all work together equally to pay off the debts. Additionally, he feared that the northern states, which struggled with more severe indebtedness, might be forced to raise taxes, precipitating a mass exodus from north to south. Unfortunately, for Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Madison, in the words of one congressman, had unquestionably the most personal influence of any man in the House of Representatives, and he held the votes to block Hamilton's proposal. Shattering the simplistic perception of the Founding Fathers as a unified monolith, this incident threatened to dissolve the Union, which may be what eventually brought both sides to the table. As the famous story goes, the two sides eventually reached an agreement at a secretive 1790 meeting between Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson. Known as the dinner table bargain, Madison agreed to roll the state's separate debts into one in exchange for moving the nation's permanent capital closer to the southern states and Madison's home state of Virginia. While historians debate the exact role the famed dinner table bargain played in reaching the 1790 compromise, it certainly marked a major turning point in the nation's history, cementing the sweeping economic powers of the federal government. Oh, and apparently the whole thing was a rap song. Starting with President Jefferson, who advocated for a government rigorously frugal and simple, applying all the possible savings of the public revenue to the discharge of the national debts, the nation slowly began to work down its national debts. As you can see in this chart, the debt fell dramatically from 30% of GDP in 1790 to 6% in 1811. As has always been true of debt and war in the nation's history, however, the War of 1812 forced America back into heavy spending and borrowing. By the time the war ended in 1815, and the national debt had climbed back up to 30% of GDP, the government was ready to pay off the debt entirely. With intense financial discipline, the U.S. managed to run budget surpluses by the early 1820s, leading President James Monroe to predict in late 1824 that the whole of the public debts may be discharged in the course of 10 years. He was followed by President John Quincy Adams, who managed to decrease the debt every year of his presidency. So, how did Adams manage to slash the national debt by roughly 25% in a single term? By doing super boring stuff like selling land. Here's how it happened. During the Panic of 1819, many farmers struggled to keep up with the payments on their property, which they had previously purchased on credits from the federal government. This led to Congress passing a series of bills, first requiring full payment for land at the time of purchase. Secondly, to encourage more sales, the government slashed the cost of public land to $1.25 per acre, even after extending their credit, hoping to outlast the financial downturn. Many farmers found they simply could not keep up with their payments. In 1825, the government proposed a new option. Farmers could relinquish their land in exchange for a discounted rate on their debts. Not only did this give the government a portion of the original money, it also permitted them to resell the land for an upfront payment. The express purpose of this deal, they said, was the extinguishment of the debts due to the United States by the purchasers of public lands. When the pledge of public lands to the public creditor shall have been redeemed by the entire discharge of the national debts, the swelling tide of wealth with which they replenish the common treasury may be made to reflow in unfailing streams of improvements from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Here to fulfill that ornate dream, Adams' successor, the man whose pompous hair adorns our cash, Andrew Jackson vowed in his inaugural address to extinguish the national debts, the unnecessary duration of which is incompatible with real independence, he said. By aggressively selling public land, canning the national bank, and slashing government spending, Jackson managed to work the nation's debts down to zero within the time frame Monroe had originally predicted. Jackson was the first and only president to completely eliminate the debts. Over the next century, the nation's spending and borrowing habits followed a fairly predictable cycle, waxing dramatically during times of national crises, including the Civil War, and waning in the aftermath of those crises. The 1930s, however, marked a major turning point.
It was in accordance with these principles that in aid to unemployment we expend some $600 million in federal construction of such public works as can be justified as bringing early and definite returns.
Since the early days of the Republic, a handful of Americans had always argued, in the words of Alexander Hamilton, that a national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. However, Jefferson's aversion to excessive deficit spending, which he and others viewed as irresponsible and immoral, had long dominated the nation's conscience. In fact, even Hamilton wrote that he ardently wishes to see it incorporated as a fundamental maxim that the creation of debt should always be accompanied with the means of its extinguishment. So prevalent was this disdain for debt that even FDR, a man who in many ways came to embody the Keynesian theory of economics, ran for president on a semi-conservative fiscal platform, vowing, for example, to balance the federal budgets. On July 30th, 1932, then Governor Roosevelt took to the air to comment on his party's national platform.
Let us have the courage to stop borrowing in order to meet continuing deficits. Let us stop the deficits themselves.
He followed that up just 2 weeks before the 1932 presidential election with a lengthy address blasting extravagant government spending. That was the Roosevelt of the early 1930s. By the next election cycle, however, he was openly arguing that to balance our budgets would be a crime against the American people. What changed? Well, obviously, Roosevelt was elected against the backdrop of the Great Depression. And as we've already noted, times of national crisis inevitably drive up the debts. But what we're looking at now was something deeper than that. A trend, a paradigm shift regarding long-established economic orthodoxies. In short, the Keynesian theory of economics. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes published an influential book titled The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in which he emphasized spending as a key factor in economic stability. The markets, Keynes argued, were too volatile to sustain proper levels of employment. Therefore, in times of economic downturn, such as the Great Depression, politicians should seek to stimulate the economy through government intervention. This theory helped legitimize deficit spending, suggesting that for Washington, penny-pinching frugality was not always a virtue. One can easily see an example of Keynes' ideas in Roosevelt's New Deal programs. But even before that, progressives had already shed the restraints of an overly restrictive view of the Constitution, preferring instead to ambitiously involve the federal government in the affairs of the American people. We can debate the efficacy of the New Deal programs elsewhere, but this much was clear. The Keynesian revolution radically upended the way Americans, and indeed the world, thought about economics, finances, and debts. Additionally, the birth of autopilot entitlement programs, including Social Security, introduced massive permanent expenditures which would augment without requiring congressional approval. As built-in expenses soared, it became increasingly difficult to dent America's mounting national debts. In his autobiography, Ronald Reagan wrote that spending for government entitlement programs accounted for 48% of federal spending during his presidency. To many members of Congress, he said, "This money is off limits forever."
As a nation, our debt has grown and grown and grown until now it totals $1.7 trillion, a number so big that it's nearly unimaginable. A single billion is 1,000 millions. A trillion is a million millions.
Perhaps more than anyone since the 1930s, Ronald Reagan repopularized notions about limited government spending, arriving at a time when faith in the Keynesian model had begun to falter.
Today, our national debt amounts to nearly $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
His public speeches and private journal entries were peppered with near constant threats about the national debts and deficit spending.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Of course, in many ways, Reagan's economic policies were a success. Inflation plummeted, taxes fell, and employment rates rebounded after an early recession. And yet, the patron saint of fiscal conservatism found himself constantly bedeviled by the most outrageous number of all.
So-called temporary increases or extensions in the debt ceiling have been allowed 21 times in these 10 years. And now I've been forced to ask for another increase in the debt ceiling, or the government will be unable to function past the middle of February. And I've only been here 16 days.
At the outset of his presidency, the national debt had not yet crossed $1 trillion.
We may, in spite of our best efforts, see a national debt in excess of $1 trillion. Now, this is a figure that's literally beyond our comprehension.
By the end of his presidency, it was nearing $3 trillion. Much of this was due to vast increases in military spending, which Reagan fans have traditionally defended. But the fact remains, the president could not balance the budget a single year of his presidency. As he once confessed despondently to his diary, we who were going to balance the budget faced the biggest budget deficits ever. If not even Reagan could do it, it seemed the runaway train was indeed unstoppable. The only question was, how long could we keep it from flying off the rails? I mentioned at the start of this video that the national debt has passed $38 trillion since Reagan left office. To put that number into perspective, you would have to sell the Walt Disney Company 4 times over to cover a single interest payment on the debts. In fact, not even the combined net worths of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Ray Dalio, George Soros, and other famous billionaires could cover a single interest payment. Many of you are probably wondering, for as much as the government takes from me in taxes, how could it possibly rack up that much debt? I mean, isn't $5 trillion in annual revenue more than enough to balance the books?
Republicans point at Democrats and say, we don't like your programs, let's cut your programs. Democrats look at Republicans and say, no, don't cut our programs, cut yours. Everybody's, don't cut mine, cut yours. People say, where would you cut? I would say everywhere.
To answer that question, I purchased a copy of the federal budget for fiscal year 2025. To be honest, I was expecting a massive, cumbersome book. Instead, I received this relatively thin pamphlet. But don't be deceived. You'll be hard-pressed to find a single book this small that packs so much spending. As you can see, you have tabs upon tabs casually dropping the most extravagant expenses. Over $12 billion for the IRS, $11 billion for international climate finance, $3 billion to advance gender equity and equality worldwide, $130 billion for the Department of Health and Human Services. It just keeps going. Whether or not you actually support these expenses is besides the point. Show me in the Constitution where it says any of this is approved. Oh, and by the way, if you want to read the appendix for the budget, you have to purchase it separately for $82. But of course, even those expenses are mere drops in a bucket compared to $38 trillion. Over the past year, for reference, the debt increased by an average of nearly $6 billion per day. The real drivers of the national debts are aging populations, the astronomical cost of healthcare in America compared to other countries, and increasingly, the interest on the debt itself. As baby boomers reach retirement age and live longer in general, Social Security costs increase dramatically, now roughly 22% of the federal budget, supported by a shrinking working age population.
If we don't do anything with Social Security, if you actually just left Social Security alone, it will cut benefits to seniors by a quarter in less than a decade. And so, no one wants to cut benefits for seniors, and yet, if you let the program go on autopilot, that's exactly what's going to happen.
But even like the Social Security website, this is under the Biden administration, on the website it would say we based on current demographic trends and how much money Social Security is bringing in versus how many Social Security recipients there are, because we have an aging population, relatively speaking, the average age is increasing. Social Security will not be able to maintain its full payments, I think, by 2032.
Meanwhile, the United States spends far more on healthcare than any other country in the world. nearly $15,000 per capita compared to an international average of less than $8,000. As a result, Medicare alone now accounts for 13% of all federal spending. With Medicaid, that number is closer to 25%. Lastly, as of September 2025, it cost more than $1.2 trillion to service the national debt, 17% of federal spending for the entire year.
So we got national debt that's just insane, where the debt payments, the interest payments on the debt exceed our entire military budget. I mean, that was one of the wake-up calls for me. I was like, wait a second, the interest on our national debt is bigger than the entire military budget?
According to Ray Dalio's book, one of the surest signs of a debt crisis is when countries have to borrow to service their debts. And considering the interest on our debt accounted for roughly a quarter of all the money the government brought in last year, such a scenario isn't inconceivable. What happens when, as multiple predictions show, interest costs soar to $2 trillion over the next decade? I set out in search of answers, and while I certainly gained a better understanding of the national debt, I must say, I have more questions than ever, urgent questions about the future of the country.
Again, my recommendations are cut spending. But if we don't do that, let's talk about the other three horror stories, which is this fiscal collapse that Elon and others are warning about. The government can always raise taxes. They could double tax burdens. But, if we did that, and not just if we did that, but if all of these other countries around the globe did that, what you would see is a massive, massive portion of people's paychecks being taken. It would make much less sense to work at all. But then there's the other two, which is that either the government can run a deficit, and if the Fed doesn't print money, if the Eurobank doesn't print, more euros, then what happens is you have interest rates go into the double digits. But then there's one other part of that as well, of course, which is that, so let's say these central banks print money. You could get Weimar Republic level hyperinflation, and that is a financial collapse all its own. So those are the four possibilities. We either come together in a responsible way to cut spending now, or we suffer crushing, unfathomable tax burdens, or interest rate lock-in, or hyperinflation, the likes of which we have never seen in this country.
I started this video by saying we were robbing our children. I'm afraid it's worse than that. We're gambling their future and the future of the country on our unwillingness to take serious action against reckless government spending. Throughout my time working on this project, I kept coming back to this quote from Dalio's book. For great countries with great empires, the end of what he calls the big debt cycle has typically meant the end of their prominence.
But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
The question is it too late to turn things around? And also, who are the career politicians who got us into this mess?
So where is the will to change? It's in either party. It's not there, and that's why the solution, our founders gave us a great solution, Neil. They gave us what's called an Article 5 Convention of the States, where if 34 states come together and say, hey, the federal government didn't create the states created the federal government, and by the way, you're spending our future of our kids and our present day